Hey y'all, I'm Sunny Shell, and tonight we're going to discuss pseudoscience. So sit back, buckle up, and let's get to the sunny spot on Skeptic Haven. Hey everyone, so glad you could join us tonight. I'm really excited because tonight I have Thomas Westbrook as my guest. Hey Thomas, you're muted.
Sorry, I muted myself for the intro. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Fantastic. I actually just got back from a conference I was speaking at in Nashville about 30 minutes ago. So I got in, quickly set everything up, and hopped on air. And here we are.
Well, I am so thankful. Even coming in last minute like that after a plane ride, I mean, that can put you in a crazy mood. So I'm really glad that you're here. For those who may not, for some reason, know who you are, can you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and where they can find you on social media?
Yeah, I'm Thomas Westbrook. I have a channel called Holy Koolaid where I talk about science and I talk about religion and atheism and skepticism and how we can know what's true and what's not true. And I try to take complex topics and break them down in these laser focused animated videos. My background is initially I was a young earth creationist. I believed in a lot of pseudoscientific ideas. I thought that aliens were living among us. I believed in spirits and demon possession and all of this stuff. And I started reaching a point in college where I fell in love with science. I realized that you can learn and you can know these things, and there's tests that you can do to figure out how the world actually works, and it's knowable. And as I was going through that process and having these aha moments, I decided, I kind of want to process this in video form and bring people along for the ride. So kind of turned into my full-time thing.
Excellent. Well, I remember when I was first getting into YouTube and finding my way out of religion and all of that. Your channel was one of the ones that I really enjoyed watching because, like you said, you're kind of laser focused on. It's like bite-sized chunks that you can actually digest and figure out. It wasn't too much too soon, and I could just kind of scroll through and figure out different topics. And you also give us ideas on how to go look in other places as well to kind of further our own studies. And I find that very useful and helpful.
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do is to examine particular ideas from a multitude of different angles. So rather than just looking at, the Bible from the standpoint of a historian or an archaeologist, you can also look at the science behind it. You can look at it from the standpoint of like textual analysis and, paleography and handwriting analysis and stuff. And like there's all these different things that you can use these various avenues to explore a particular idea and see if like Noah's Ark actually happened. Then, we can study geology, we can study dendrochronology, we can study, ice cores and stuff that have records. And there's so many different overlapping fields. And if we just focus in on one, we might be able to make the data points work. But I think it's so much more fascinating when we're able to take a big picture view and like look at all of these different fields and kind of see like if we have all of the data like a Venn diagram, what fits all of it, what matches all of the data that we have. So that's what I try to do, is to kind of approach it from different angles. And even though I'm not an expert in these areas, sometimes I'll have people on who are, and just try to get this big picture view.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Because the goal is to believe as many true things as possible. When you have all those different layers, it's like a plethora of evidence, of credible evidence. And you almost don't have a choice anymore, but to start, focusing on reality instead. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're talking about pseudoscience. And I know that that's a popular topic that you have on your show. So to start out, I was really wanting to know, what are some of the differences between science and pseudoscience?
Yeah, so science, a lot of times when we hear the word science, we think of either, a guy in a lab coat in a chemistry lab performing some experiment, or we think of the scientific method, and it's just basically that little circular process that we all hear about in high school, where it's like, all right, you make an observation, you ask a question, you form a hypothesis, you go out and you test it, and you analyze your data, and you come to this result, and then you iterate and repeat. But that's such a small part of the scientific process. It's like, yes, it is incredibly important to make these hypotheses and test them and analyze and stuff. But there's ways that within that you can dive deeper and be like, okay, well, what if you do that process, but you're not gathering enough data? Maybe you have a sample size that's really small and you're only looking at a few instances, and they might be the outliers and they're the exception to the rule. Or maybe you have a bunch of stuff, but you're not sampling it randomly. And so you might have a skewed result in your data. Like, there's all these things that people have put in place over the years to improve this process, to try to take some of the bias out and to make it so that you have something that in an unbiased, as unbiased as possible, objective experiment that is replicable, that you can always be able to test this and get the same results. And so science, it's not this just collection of knowledge. It's not just this, set of books in the library that is dogmatically accepted by this ivory tower of, experts. It's an ongoing process, and the goal of science is to try to figure out what the truth is, even if it means destroying ideas that were previously held. But hopefully in doing that process, we continue to become more and more precise, more accurate, and get a better picture of how the world works. With pseudoscience, on the other hand, it tends to be oftentimes unfalsifiable. So you might make a claim about something that's like, oh yeah, there's a bunch of Bigfoot that are roaming around up in this forest up here. Well, how come we've never seen them? Well, they're hidden. They're really hard to see. And well, we should be able to at least have pictures. Well, we do, but they're blurry. Okay, well, do we have a body of these things? Well, we did, but the government came along and destroyed the evidence. And it's like, there's not really a way to test it and to falsify it, or to, whereas with science, a good hypothesis is one that can be falsified. It's one that you can test and show if it's right or wrong. And with pseudoscience, oftentimes it's not. And they'll rely heavily on anecdotes rather than data. So it'll just be like, well, I heard this person say, or I saw this, or I was out in a field and I got abducted by aliens, and when I returned, my bum felt funny. And it's like, okay, an anecdote is, it has its places, but it's one of the most it's one of the least valuable forms of data in science, because our brains are super deceptive. We can misremember things, we can have false memories, we can see things incorrectly, our eyesight isn't as great as we think, our brain can be tampered with like drugs and stuff like that, and we can hallucinate. And so there's all these different reasons why anecdotes aren't the best form of evidence. And if you have a bunch of different people who all have flawed ways of making observations, even if there's a lot of anecdotes that have similarities, that's not the same as actually having good scientific measurements and good scientific data. And so there's just little things like that, where the goal of science is to be able to falsify, test, demonstrate, and then make it clear, share the knowledge publicly, publish it in journals that are reviewed by people who know how these fields work, who are experts, that can go through and rip your paper to shreds if it doesn't use good methodology. So if you're relying on logical fallacies, or if you're relying on cognitive biases that you have, then a good peer reviewer would go in and look at that paper and say, hey, this isn't sound science right here. Like, you're making a mistake, or you didn't do the math right on this problem. And so they'll point out the errors and send it back to you. And it's only once it passes that process that they're like, okay, good. Like, it doesn't matter if it goes against what the consensus is. If you have done the work and your observations or your conclusions match all of the data, and you do it correctly, then it's rewarded. You're overturning a long held theory in science, and you get a Nobel Prize, because it's like, oh man, you just made our understanding of the world better. And that it's encouraged. Whereas with pseudoscience, oftentimes they'll rely on technobabble. So they'll just throw out all these big words. You'll hear like Deepak Chopra be like, and the quantum connections of the deep whatever, and he'll throw out these big words, and it sounds science-y if you don't have any training in a particular scientific field. But then if you actually kind of string it together and like look up like what is he saying, when you put all these words together and you actually get a definition for it, it's like this is jargon. Like it doesn't make any sense. And the goal is more to obfuscate than it is to educate. And so
Right.
that's kind of one of the big differences is like science is to try to illuminate and show us how the world works and have a way of figuring it out. Whereas with pseudoscience, oftentimes it will just appeal to these extraordinary, wild, far out claims and say you can't prove it. It's unfalsifiable. They'll use technobabble to kind of like, make it a little bit harder to tell what they're saying. And then they'll cherry pick little data points and rather than giving like the big picture.
Yeah, I've even seen in professional circles that pseudoscience can sometimes infiltrate. I think it's easy for us, and probably through our own biases, we end up infiltrating kind of mainstream sciences. For instance, when I was in college, in one of my psychology classes, we had a professor who was really into things like hypnosis and things that were kind of on the fringe and what I would characterize as pseudoscience. But he was like, we're just on the verge of breakthroughs in this. But he never really had any great data or sources. So I think it's interesting as we're talking about this, that even people who are extremely intelligent and have knowledge bases can find themselves kind of on that edge between credible science and pseudoscience. Wouldn't you agree?
Right on the tip of the rabbit hole about to take the plunge.
Right. Exactly.
One foot in, one foot out. And yeah, and that's something that, you see a lot with, oftentimes religion, that people will compartmentalize beliefs so that they might have a particular idea that is appealing to them or that they have been brought up with, that they're emotionally attached to. And so they'll hold on to this idea, but it might not match what they know about how the world works. So they might hear about, the Genesis accounts and these stories that about a young earth and giving these exact genealogical dates. And so they want to hold on to that, but at the same time, they know that it doesn't match the data. So they might kind of compartmentalize and they might, say, well, I go to church and I believe in, the message of love and the message of Jesus. And this part was maybe allegorical, or, this part of the Bible is more of a metaphor. It's not meant to be taken literally, but I still believe this stuff. And so they're kind of like teetering on the edge when it comes to things like, hypnosis or I honestly haven't looked too deeply into hypnosis. I have been quote unquote hypnotized where I was brought on stage by a stage magician. And I can tell you that in that instance, at the very least, I felt like it was kind of a like scam or like not like she was deliberately scamming, but I think the audience was all just kind of going along with it and humoring her. But you also have to have within science, to have a good theory, you have to have a plausible mechanism by which it can take place. And if you're taking something like hypnosis, it's like, okay, how is this happening? How is it being pulled off? Like what regions of the brain are being triggered? How are they being triggered? If you have one hypnotist that's like, oh, I make this particular sound, and another one's like, well, I say these particular words, and another one's like, well, I wave something in front of your eyes and, it makes you kind of get sleepy. And another one's like, well, I just, select people who are already suggestible. It's like, okay, they're all doing it in different ways. Are they doing the same thing? Are they, what mechanism are they using to get there? Is it some neurological pathway that we can observe in fMRI machines? If so, great. I don't know how much testing has been done on hypnosis, because that's not an area that I've looked deeply into yet. But in order for something to pass the sniff test, you should be able to have some type of mechanism, or else you don't have a theory, you just have an observation.
Right.
You just have oh, this is interesting, this is weird, some people will do this. Okay, well, theory one, or not theory one, but hypothesis one would be, okay, maybe these people are all going along with it because they're up on stage and they don't want to embarrass or humiliate the hypnotist. And so they're kind of going along. Maybe others are on stage and they're faking it until they make it because they really want to be hypnotized. They think it'd be a cool, weird, fun experience. And they think that as long as they keep on going along with it, eventually it'll maybe actually be hypnosis and they're under the control of this other person, or that it's having some long-term influence on them to keep them from smoking. Or maybe they just feel empowered by the power of suggestion, where it's like, hey, I didn't think I could do it, but if I believe it's like a placebo, where now I can quit smoking because the hypnotist suggested it. Or maybe the hypnotist is actually controlling their mind. Like, those are several different competing possible hypotheses. And so if you look at that and you're like, okay, here we've got all these different possible options, how can we narrow it down and test it? How can we figure out which one is true? And in the realm of pseudoscience, you would have people say, well, in this case, in this instance, you tested it and there was, the person wasn't under the control of the hypnotist. They were just kind of going along with it. But in other cases, it's real. And they do the same thing with psychics. They'll say, well, this psychic was caught scamming people and he was using these techniques and didn't pass the test. But a real psychic, I know a real psychic. And then you bring them out and test them and it doesn't pass the test. And it's like, okay, well, you're always going to have some excuse or some reason why, well, this case, this instance didn't work. Well, until you can show that it does work, then every single time that you've tried to test it, there hasn't been evidence. And it's just this unfalsifiable thing that, well, there's a real thing out there. And so until you have the evidence, it's kind of like, well, it's sort of on the fringes of pseudoscience at the very least.
Right. I think it's also good to talk about how we can have credible testing, because anyone can test things and they can inadvertently put their own biases into the test itself. So scientists work really hard to remove biases that can crop in, even from the testers themselves, scientists who are performing the test. And then they're very meticulous in record keeping and making sure that that they try to account for any environmental factors or all these extra things. It takes a lot to put together a credible, viable scientific test. It's not just, okay, I'll try it this time and I'll take some acid this time and maybe next time I won't take acid and we'll see what happens. It's more of a controlled scientific test, and then they publish it like you talked about earlier. People then try to replicate it and they tear each other apart. That's the part of it. Tear the findings apart. That's the purpose of it. We want to have our hypothesis torn apart.
Yeah. And there's different types of tests too within science. So you might have like an observational study, or you might have like within political science, you might gather a ton of data from different nations and you might put together a report where you're trying to see if different things are correlated, or if there is a causal connection, and you're breaking it down, and you might be analyzing a ton of different things at once because you're not sure what's causing what. Because just because two things are correlated, it doesn't mean that one causes the other one. So you're looking at it, you're trying to figure out what came first that might have caused the other thing. Is there some other factor that might be affecting it and causing this result to happen? And so you're doing those studies. And then there's also like clinical trials when you're, let's say that you're testing a new drug, you might test it against a placebo, against a sugar pill that really doesn't do anything, but it might have a psychosomatic effect where the person thinks that something's happening, but it's not going to cure their cancer. It's not going to have a long-term effect. It's not going to, regrow a limb. It's only going to affect things that have a connection with your psychology, with your mind. And so you want to make sure that, hey, is this drug that I'm giving them, is it actually doing something more than a placebo that merits the risk of the potential side effects? And is it safe to use? So you're testing it against a placebo, but you don't want to necessarily give away to the person which one they're taking, because their knowledge of the experiment might skew the results.
Mm-hmm.
It might change how they respond to it. So you don't tell them which one they're getting. And then you do the same thing with the doctors. If the doctors know who's getting what, sometimes that influences the doctor's mannerisms and how they interact with the patient. And how they interpret the data. And so you try to double blind it, where basically the person performing the experiment and the subjects who are undergoing these trials, neither one of them know what they're taking until the end, when you're like examining the data at scale and you're like, oh wow, we had 100,000 participants, and this many took the sugar pill and this many took this drug, and it looks like the drug had a 25% increased recovery rate from this disease, as opposed to nothing at all. It's like, well, okay, that's something. If and they have to do statistical analyses too to see, is this does this fall within the margin of error? Because it's possible that there's just a little bit of a statistical anomaly, but as you get a bigger and bigger sample, then you're performing the test right, then that margin for error might shrink down a little bit. And so you are doing all of these different things to try to safeguard the results and make sure that your biases don't slip into the results. And with pseudoscience, you don't have that level of rigorous scrutiny and that level of rigorous testing. And oftentimes when you do have tests that are done to try to, prove that some pseudoscientific idea is true, oftentimes it's done with the intention of proving what they already believe to be true, rather than with the intention of trying to falsify something to make sure that it withstands scrutiny. And so when you have someone who, is resistant to change and resistant to their ideas being proven wrong, oftentimes they'll select a journal to publish to that is a predatory journal. It's just a pay to play. Anyone can publish. It's not really rigorously scrutinized. And so they're just like, oh, I'll publish in this one. And that's why within science, there are journals that are respectable, that are reliable, that their entire business model is that they are known for their academic rigor, and they're known for really heavily scrutinizing and having experts that do their due diligence. And those are the journals that universities will subscribe to. And so they make their money from subscriptions, not from the scientists themselves paying the journal to have their own research published, because then anyone and everyone can publish. So you have these kind of safeguards in place to try to make sure that like the data is as good as possible. And then in addition to that, people ask, well, who are these peers? Who are these magical peers that are reviewing papers? Is it just your friends? Because when you hear colloquially, oh, my peers, it's like, oh yeah, my buddy, Steve over here, Bob over here. Like, no, that's not your peers. You're when something is peer reviewed, it means that the academic journal selects the experts who review it. You don't get to choose. You don't get to decide who reviews it. If you're doing a paper on geology, you don't select a dentist to review your data. You select someone who's got a PhD in geology, who's been, doing stuff in the field, who knows this particular subset, this unique thing that you're looking at. They'll look at your results and say, yeah, this checks out. I might not agree with his conclusion, or, I might not, I might have my own ideas as to why this is happening, but he did the work right and he defended his research. So yeah, he's good to go. And so that's what it means for something to be peer reviewed. It's not just like, oh yeah, there was, some other guy that, had a similar field that I hand selected to look over it and publish in some unaccredited pay to publish journal.
Exactly. And you can even have people who are both, say you're doing something in geology and having two PhD geologists looking at it, but they both have similar ideas and they have worked together on things. That still has an inherent bias with it. So like you were saying, it's reviewed by someone that you did not choose, even, not even just a dentist, or your friend Bob down the street, but there's a level of inherent bias that can come in to these if you just by knowing each other.
Well, and even once you publish, if you publish a paper that goes against, the scientific consensus at the time, and you're like, hey, I've found some new data, here's the shocking new observation that I made, but you do the work right, then chances are that paper is going to send ripples throughout the community. And it's not just going to be the people who, the people who peer reviewed your paper who are going to be responding to it. You're probably going to bring on the eyes of a lot of other scientists in that field now who are just going to rip it to shreds if there's mistakes in it. And they're going to publish their own papers, and they're going to, show why your ideas and your results are BS. And if it turns out that you made a mistake and that the person who peer reviewed it didn't catch it, or it turns out that your data was contaminated, or that, that there was some, you were caught tampering with the data or something, then journals have an obligation to retract papers. And so oftentimes you'll see at the top of a publication, it'll say retracted for, reasons like that. So you're constantly under this microscope of, if I publish my work, I better do my due diligence. Right. And it's, now that it's out there, is this paper having an impact? And so various publications will have an impact factor, which is basically a rating, a score that a paper gets for, like, how often is this cited in other papers and other publications. And so if you have something that is like, hey, here's this unknown, obscure, journal that no one's ever heard of, published this paper that really didn't make any waves and wasn't really of any interest, then it's not going to have a very high impact factor. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong. It doesn't necessarily mean that it was a bad paper. It just means that it's not necessarily the most impactful. And, you could have someone potentially who is publishing a paper, and then they're, going out and trying to get as many citations as possible and citing their own papers. But then there's organizations that are literally set up to try to safeguard against self-citation affecting the impact factor. So there's all these little things where it's like, whenever there's like a little weakness in science, or there's a possibility for mistakes or bias or something, then the scientific community usually, once they recognize it, try to find solutions or try to find ways to prevent or fix these problems. And it doesn't mean that it's a perfect system. It's very much not. And there's still areas where science can grow, but it's the best system that we've got, because there really isn't an alternative right now that is, able to get to truth in the way that science can.
Right, exactly. And I think it's interesting too that when there are mistakes, it is science and scientists that correct it. I mean, I think that's pretty interesting. It's one thing that the religious tend to use as, or try to use as a weakness, saying, well, it always changes. But that's because of a misunderstanding and not even wanting to understand what it means to have rigorous peer review of scientific studies and so forth.
And when it changes, it's not like it goes. So a lot of times people will say, well, science gets stuff wrong all the time. And it's like, okay, well, science is just a process. Scientists make mistakes all the time. And sometimes, the academic consensus is incorrect, or it's partially correct. But when it gets updated, when a new theory comes along and disproves it, it's based off of new data. It's based off of new evidence, and it's replaced with a new theory that fits the data better than the old one did. Science goes forward. This paradigm shift never goes in the opposite direction, where all of a sudden it goes back to something that's already been falsified, that's already been disproven. So if, let's say that there's a particular test we can perform to see if, hey, is there, within fire, is there this substance called phlogiston, or is it chemistry that's going on? Is it, chemical reactions that is happening? That's, and if, let's say that you are able to falsify and refute this, idea of phlogiston, then you're not all of a sudden, when you realize that, oh, hey, we didn't realize this, but we thought that chemistry was just like molecules made of protons, neutrons, and electrons, but it turns out that there's these things called quarks and gluons and this stuff. It's like, wow, we didn't realize that it was so much more complicated, and we had such a simplistic understanding. All of a sudden now we have a better view of chemistry. We have a better view of how the world works. We have more precision. We have, higher resolution of information, able to understand this stuff. And it's not like all of a sudden we revert back to something that's already falsified. And so
Right.
that's oftentimes whenever I hear people say like, well, science got stuff wrong all the time. And so how do you know that psychic stuff isn't real? And it's like, really, like this is something that we have repeatedly tested again and again and again and again. There's no plausible mechanism that's been put forth, and it's repeatedly been falsified. And it's never once, been shown to be real or have any veracity to it. Is it possible that just the few psychics out there is hiding under a cliff somewhere or in a cave somewhere, and we just don't know of them, and there's a lot of charlatans who are the only ones that we've seen? Yeah, I guess it could be like a black swan type of thing where it like exists out there and we just haven't seen it yet. But there are certain things within science that like it's not just a matter of like we haven't seen it, so therefore it's not true. Like there's some stuff that is like, yeah, we've tested these claims to see if how something operates. And it's like every time that you drop a ball, it falls to the earth and it doesn't just float up into space. And so you're like, okay, well, we know that there's some type of force that's causing it to fall to the ground, and we can learn more and more about gravity, and we can refine that, and we can figure out that Newtonian mechanics was pretty good, but Einstein's theories of relativity were able to get that even better and make it more accurate. And now we can make calculations out to so many more decimals than we could before. But it's not like all of a sudden Newtonian mechanics is complete garbage and thrown out. It's like, no, it's still incredibly useful and incredibly accurate for most things at the macro level. It just doesn't account for, the orbit of Mercury or something.
Right, right, exactly. So we've talked about the differences between science and pseudoscience. We've even talked about some of the characteristics of pseudoscience and science. I'd really like to get into some examples and really kind of hone in on that. But before we do, I want to let everyone in the audience know, first of all, thank you guys for joining us. There's a lot of great conversations going on in the chat. If you have questions that you want to ask Thomas, please put them in the chat and we'll get them on. If you're a Patreon and you would like to come on and actually talk to Thomas yourself, please let us know and we'll get you that. That's one of the perks of being a Patreon. So the first one that, as we've been talking, I had just a whole list, but as we've been talking, the thing that keeps coming up in my brain is homeopathy. And that's because there's so many people who think that things like homeopathy or essential oils and things like that is actually rooted in science when it's not. So I wanted to talk a little bit about homeopathy. Are you familiar with homeopathy?
Yes. So the basics of homeopathy is there's two different core concepts within it. And one is this idea that like cures like. And so if let's say that you have a particular disease or a particular illness, then if you're exposed to it, that is the cure. But then it's also that the more you dilute it down, the more concentrated it becomes. And so you might have a particular homeopathic remedy that has been diluted down so many times where it's like taking an eyedropper, taking one drop out of a solution, putting it in something else, filling it all the way up with water, taking one drop, putting it in something else, filling it all the way up, to the point where like there's absolutely nothing left of the original solution because it's been diluted so many times. Like that's the power of exponents. That's the power of taking things to, the nth degree. And so there's no mechanism by which this could even occur, because unless water has memory, and it's like that, I love the quote by Tim Minchin, which is like somehow it might remember, water might remember a little bit of onion juice that it had, but it doesn't remember all the poo that it had in it.
Yeah.
It's like where is this stuff? Like where are these chemicals still hanging out in the water? And how is it that the less there is of it, the more concentrated it becomes? That goes against everything that we know about how toxicology works. It goes against everything that we know about how nutrition works, about how biology and anatomy works. So if you take a particular, like anything can be poisonous and toxic, right? It's the dose that makes the poison. So if I drink 10,000 cups of water, I'm gonna die. But if I drink like a few drops of cyanide, that might be enough to kill me. It just matters like how much of something that you take. Some things are very, 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 very um, either venomous if it's like a, animal poison, or it's poisonous if it's, I believe, like either from manufactured substances or from various plants and stuff. And so if that's the case, then that goes against everything that homeopathy is claiming. So, all right, we should be able to test this. And when you test homeopathy against a placebo, when you test it in a double-blind trial, it doesn't pass the test. It doesn't outperform placebos at all. And so for that reason, whenever these homeopathic companies, or these companies that are making alternative medicine, will put forth a remedy like that, they never get it approved by the FDA. They're not willing to put it up for that kind of scrutiny, and they don't call it medicine for that reason. So they'll literally have these disclaimers at the bottom of their site that says, not meant to this product has not been tested, and we're not claiming that it can prevent, cure, or do anything to get rid of any disease. And so if that's the case, it's like they're literally straight up saying, like, this hasn't been tested, it hasn't been shown to work. And it's like the second that they do that, the second that they go through those hoops and do those tests and prove that it works, then it's medicine. Like, that's what it becomes. And so that's where I stand on homeopathy.
Yeah, and I think that the big frustration I get is that when people see that it has been no conclusive test, there's every test has been bunked. Then they say things like, "Well, big pharma just doesn't want us to know the truth," and
Are you kidding me? Big pharma would raise the price on homeopathy and sell it themselves if it worked.
Exactly. And you understand why people, have. I mean, I get it, but it's so frustrating.
Not only that, but this whole idea of like big pharma. Do you know how big the alternative medicine industry is? It's a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Mm-hmm.
It's huge. And so this idea that it's just like, oh, these big corporations, they're so evil, they don't want, it's like, yeah, are there things that don't get researched, that don't get allocated funding for research because there's not a whole lot of money to be made on the end result product? There's not a huge demand for it. Yeah, it absolutely is. In that way, like, yeah, big pharma really is influencing stuff. Are there's some drugs maybe that that pharmaceutical companies choose to promote and choose and jack the price way up on and price gouge people on in a way that they can't afford, like insulin? Yeah, there definitely needs to be regulation. I'm not a fan of big pharmaceutical companies. I think there's a lot of problems that need to be fixed. But in terms of taking a remedy or taking some medicine that has been tested, that has been shown to have some effect, that the entire reason why we have the FDA in place, not that companies don't lobby and influence the government, but the whole reason that we make laws is to protect people from, as a safeguard against this corporate greed and these evils and stuff. That's why there's regulations on cars that prevent them from, spewing so much pollution into the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. Why we have catalytic converters on our cars and stuff. And so it's like the reason that the FDA exists is so that you can't just make a wild claim about something being, medicine that can cure your disease and selling it, and it turns out to be snake oil. It's a consumer protection law. So is it perfect? No, but it's a hell of a lot better than something that's like alternative medicine, some homeopathic cure that's like, hey, this can, cure your cancer, and people dump a ton of money into these essential oils and they wind up dead because they're not getting the treatment that they need.
Yeah, exactly. That's very frustrating. Shane in the chat said they're not clearly labeled and they are right next to the actual medicine. That makes it very difficult for the layperson to really understand. But that's the key, to look for FDA.
Yeah, it's true, because I went into the pharmacy like a year ago, and I forget what it was like. I had some, it was like maybe it was like a cold or something. I don't even remember what it was. But I remember grabbing something off the shelf that said, oh yeah, it helps with this. And I almost got it because I was like, oh, hey, like, here's this product. And it, it was packaged exactly like a medical product, exactly like, some cold medicine or whatever. And I flipped it around to look at the back, and it even had like active ingredients and all of this stuff. And I was like, huh, interesting. I've never heard of that. And, and I was like reading down, and then it had like in tiny, tiny print something about like homeopathy, like not FDA approved or whatever. I was like, oh my God. Cause like I think that the pharmacist even said, like, I was asking for something, and the pharmacist even came up and said, well, you can do this one, or here's this other one that you can do, and this one's cheaper. So I recommend this to a lot of people, and it's just as effective. And I was like, the pharmacist literally just recommended a homeopathic product to me. And I'm like, you realize that only one of these actually does something, right? Like, I would hope that this other one is cheaper. It's basically water.
Right. Yeah. You're paying for
Yeah.
water. That is unbelievable. That really ticks me off because you trust your pharmacist.
Mhm.
Or most people do. You go and you ask them questions about interactions between medications, and people all the time ask, is this better or that better? That's really frustrating.
Yeah.
Wes has an alternative JPEG that he wanted to show. Alternative medicine, by definition, has either not been proven to work or been proven not to work. Do you know what they call alternative medicine that has been proven to work? Medicine. Honestly, I love Tim Minchin. He is one of the best. I could listen to him 100,000 times.
Yeah. If people haven't seen his video Storm, it's where that quote comes from. It's really good. Theo in the chat said, only advantage is that you can't overdose on homeopathic meds. Yeah. And a beautiful example of that is when James Randi, he used to get up and give talks. He gave a TED talk where he did this, where he'd get up and take a whole bottle of homeopathy pills, sleeping pills, and just like down the whole bottle. And he's like, now, if this stuff actually worked, I should be dead in a few minutes. And he like looks at his watch. It's like, but I got 15. So let's see if I can make it through the talk.
It's such a sad day when he passed. So we do have a couple questions that from the audience. We'll start there from our viewers. Aaron asks, what is the best way to convince someone that they're believing things that are untrue? That's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's difficult, because if you just present someone with evidence and it's an emotionally held belief, a lot of times you encounter a backfire effect where it's me versus you. I'm presenting my data, you're presenting yours, and boom, we both come away more entrenched in our beliefs. So I'm a big fan of street epistemology, which is a method that Anthony Magnabosco has trumpeted for a long time. If you like go into YouTube and look it up, where you just ask people questions like, that's interesting. How do you think that works? And how confident are you in that belief? And how can we know if that's true or not? I think guided questions where, like I was just listing off some things that are kind of the telltale signs, differences between science versus pseudoscience. So, you could present an alternative scenario that they don't have an emotional attachment to. So someone might put forth an idea about, the Twin Towers and saying, 9/11, that Bush did it or something. And so you say, okay, that's really interesting. Well, how do you think we can know that? Well, it was said by all these other people. It's like, well, true, but like, are anecdotes the best form of evidence? Because a lot of people have also made claims about Bigfoot and stuff. Oh yeah, well, these people are experts and yada yada. Okay, well, how can we test this? How is this a claim that are they just being resistant to change? Is it something that can be falsified? Do they commit logical fallacies? Does it rely on, like a lot of times with conspiracy theories, it relies on a lack of evidence. They're just hiding the evidence from you. Well, you can say that to argue for aliens. And the reason that we can't find the alien bodies is because they're hidden in Area 51 somewhere. Or you can use it to argue about the reptilians, or, the Anunnaki, or whoever else, and the Atlanteans. Are they cherry picking evidence? Like, what if you present them with more and you're like, hey, like, okay, you've got that. And then there's also this data and this data and this data and this data. Like, let's get a big picture view and kind of see like what fits all of it. I think that there's ways to do it. I don't really do one-on-one engagement as much. I prefer really diving in and exploring all of the counter arguments and learning the other position as best I can. And once I know that position and I know their counter arguments and or their common rebuttals and stuff, then I'll try to head that off before they have a chance to. So I'll say, present an argument in a particular way and say, and I know that it's, because then they realize, like, I'm not just misrepresenting them. I want to steel man their position. I want to present it as strong as I possibly can and give them the benefit of the doubt, listen charitably. But then, like, when I present their position as, like, yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. Thank you for, like, not skewing my position. And then I say, okay, so I know that this is a common rebuttal and this is the position, but there's this. And when we really peel back the layers and look at this, and gather all of the data together, we get a different picture.
That I really love that, because when I was in college, that was a lot of my professors would say that the only way you can truly know your own viewpoint is by fully understanding the opposing viewpoints. And so anytime that I would, not just me, but anyone would make a claim, we would immediately be tasked with an assignment to research the opposing viewpoint and be able to argue that viewpoint. Yeah. And I think that you're exactly right. You can't possibly get any point across if you are, straw manning someone else's argument. You really need to present it in the very best possible way. So I think that's great. I just love that you highlighted that.
Well, and if you're able to rebut your own argument and then look at the rebuttal and say, and now I'm going to rebut all of those claims, and it still supports your original argument, and you really know it inside and out, even better than your opponent does. Now you learned your own position because you've learned how to rebut their claims better. And so you're not just on the spot, like caught with your drawers down with an argument that you weren't expecting. Instead, you're like, yeah, I've heard this stuff. I'm aware of this stuff. I'm familiar with it. And I've looked into it. Here's some resources, but don't just like blast links at people, show them, don't tell, give them actual tools and show them, maybe test it, demonstrate it, try it. There's a great video by this guy who, speaking of the 9/11 stuff, he was talking about how this claim about jet fuel doesn't burn hot enough, and so it couldn't have possibly melted the beams. And then he like goes into his blacksmith workshop and takes this steel bar and like heats it up. He's like, this is the temperature that it gets to. And then he like takes it and it becomes like a noodle and he just like yanks it back and forth. He's like, it doesn't have to melt. It just has to get like hot enough to like decrease the structural integrity. And it was just this demonstration by this blacksmith. And it was so powerful because it's like, oh, I get it. Like it's, metal becomes a lot less rigid once it's hot. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have we have so many different ones that I would love to talk about, and we don't have enough time to get to them all. So I'll just like pick out a couple of, or at least one more. What about? Let's talk about flat Earth. Flat Earth is another great well, I don't know if you would call it pseudoscience as much as it is a conspiracy theory, but I think because of. Go ahead.
It can be both.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at Answers in Genesis, they actually have quote unquote scientists who are putting forth their own version of evidence. So I guess that would be considered pseudoscience. So what would you say about flat Earth as a pseudoscience?
Well, if we kind of go back to the differences between science and pseudoscience, one of the big problems with flat Earth is not only does it not fit the data, not only does it go against mountains of evidence, it also relies on an appeal to conspiracy. Everyone is covering it up. Everyone is in on it. All of the evidence that is against the flat Earth is all forged, and it's all set out to make this great fake. To what? For what reason? What possible reason is there? And they say it with absolute certainty. It's like, oh, well, it's the devil is trying to spread misinformation and stray the flock away, or NASA is just trying to lie to you to hide the truth. What truth? Like about the shape of the Earth? What's the incentive? What's the goal there? And even if they all agree on a particular reason, it's like, what possible plausible mechanism is there to explain for the seasons, to explain for why it's night one place but day another, to explain why we can literally travel around the world, to explain why the planets orbit the way that they do, to explain, things like just there's so many things like that that they might create one model and it might account for a couple things, but it doesn't account for all of it. And once you start really getting into the math and getting into, trying to understand the stuff, it all breaks down. And so it's like, okay, you have a particular idea that doesn't fit all of the evidence, even in one field, let alone when you start expanding out into dozens of different fields that are overlapping. It relies on a tremendous amount of conspiracy, like appeal to a conspiracy. And it's always unfalsifiable. It's like, all right, well, can you, show me evidence of the flat earth? Like, is there any way that you can show, like, and they're like, well, the pictures that are of space, they're with a fisheye lens, and when you correct for that, then it's flat. And so it's like, okay, but what about the pictures that aren't done using a fisheye lens? Oh, well, they're NASA photoshopping, and it's not really real. Okay, well, what about all of the satellites and stuff that aren't from NASA, that are from private companies that have sent up satellites? Well, they're all in on it. Really? Like, all the hundreds and hundreds of different satellites from all of the different space agencies, from all of the other countries, including both the US and the Soviet Union, both having space missions when they were literally at war with each other. And it would be a great way to like humiliate the enemy by showing how they were lying to their own people. And there's just so much there that it relies on, and there's not a plausible mechanism. It's just that you feel special because you have this special knowledge, you're part of this special group, and you haven't felt that before, and you hear all these cool things that sound tantalizing and interesting, and you latch onto it because you want to know something cool. But the fact is, like, I guarantee you that science is way freaking cooler. There's so much more just like fascinating information like at your fingertips that can be known. And when you really start diving into it, it's way more interesting than all of these conspiracies.
Yep, absolutely. Do you think that flat Earth is primarily a religious, a way to try to get the Bible to be true, or are there people who believe in the flat Earth nonsense that necessarily are not religious?
I've talked to a few people who, well, I've talked to one, and then I've seen a few others who are non-religious atheist flat earthers.
Wow.
But I do think that the majority of the flat earth community is religious, and a lot of the reasoning is religious, and it's based off of biblical descriptions of the earth.
Yeah.
But it's not all of them. But it usually is. Oftentimes when you find people who are believing in a particular conspiracy theory, they very rarely believe in just one. There's usually a number of, things that they're falling prey to, because we don't really teach critical thinking in high school. It's not a requirement. We don't teach people how to really analyze and think through this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So producer Wes has a question for you. Are there things you recall believing that you've figured out since is pseudoscience?
Yes. Well, this is interesting because I want to, there's a caveat. I used to believe in like UFO visitation and aliens that are here on Earth right now that are being hidden by the government from us. And I don't anymore. I do believe that there are most likely alien life forms that exist on other planets. The universe is huge. I think it's statistically very implausible that we are the only life in the universe. There's probably other, exoplanets out there around some stars that have life. But I don't think that aliens are currently being hidden from us and currently walking among us here on Earth. And I remember when I was about 17, I just went down the YouTube rabbit hole and I was watching all these conspiracy theory videos, and they were showing like all these bodies. And I didn't know the source of any of this footage. It was just things people were uploading to YouTube and passing off as real. And since then, I've like learned a number of them. Like one of them was this guy who like literally would make conspiracy theory things. Another was like a famous body for like a movie set that was taken out of context and posted. And then there were certain ones that were different, like CGI things. There were things that were mistaken as UFOs. But the one that really got me was there was this shot of this alien that passed in front of this camera. And I was like, oh my God. Like I was shocked. And then like I showed my roommates, I was trying to argue with them and convince them that aliens were real and that they were living among us. And I showed them this clip and they just burst out laughing. And I was like, what? And they're like, dude, that's literally from the movie Signs. And it was just this moment where like I was embarrassed, and it was like enough of a rude awakening to myself where I was able to realize like I've been so open-minded that my brain has fallen out and I've just accepted everything. And I haven't been thinking critically. And if I fell that hard for something that is literally like a movie that is you know, filmed in Hollywood, I'm like, there's got to be a better way to figure out if this stuff is true. Like, not everything on the internet is true. And so that was for me at 17 was kind of a rude awakening. But then, like, I used to believe in angels and demon possession, and young Earth, and that Noah's Ark happened, and that there was a global flood. Like, there was a lot of this stuff that I bought into because that's what I was raised on, and I was taught logic, but I wasn't taught critical thinking. I wasn't taught about logical fallacies. I wasn't taught about cognitive biases and how easily we fool ourselves and how easily we're deceived. I didn't know how gullible we can be and how easy we are to fool because I didn't know anything about like magic tricks and conjuring and con artists and how they pull these tricks off. And I didn't realize that just because something, one thing that I learned that's kind of helped me to safeguard against pseudoscience is that whenever there's a really ridiculous, far-fetched thing that someone is proposing, like I am healing this person, or I am making this thing disappear or teleport, or I can read minds, or I'm psychic, a lot of times you'll see people say things like, oh, it's CGI, or oh, it's this, or oh, it's that, and they know that it has to be this thing, and that's the only way it can be. And the thing is, most of the time, most magic tricks, most forms of deception can be pulled off 10 different ways. And if the person comes along and says, oh no, see, it's not this, it's not that, and they show it's, and then are you going to suddenly start believing a far-fetched claim when it hasn't been put through proper testing, when it hasn't been, there's one example of this is back in, I think like the 70s, I did a video on it where James Randi sent Banachek and how was the other guy's name? I forget. He sent these two magicians into a physics lab without telling the lab that they were magicians. And they fooled the socks off of them. And they went in and they started, bending objects with their minds and doing all this stuff. And Randi even told the scientists, like, hey, here's some safeguards that you can put in place to try to prevent being fooled. Mark every single object, not with like a tag that can be removed, but with like an indelible mark that's like on the object itself. Before and after, weigh the objects. Don't let them bring in their own objects. Supply your own instruments. Film everything. Like there were so many different safeguards that he put into place. Only observe one of them at a time and stuff. But instead they came in and they were so trusting and stuff, and like they just got completely deceived. And so it's like that's a case study as an example in how like you can be fooled. And oftentimes there's 20 different ways to do the same trick. And just because you realize that they're not doing it one way, it doesn't suddenly mean that this extraordinary claim has any merit to it. And that's why you have to have falsifiable experiments that you can perform in order to test for this stuff.
Yep, absolutely. And I miss Randi too. I wish I would have been able to know him. You're talking about that. And I remember when I was young, I was over at, I think I was maybe in the 5th or 6th grade. I was at a friend's house and she had a Ouija board. And back then Ouija boards were like, oh my gosh, we're dabbling in with getting close to some devil stuff here. And we were sitting or laying down on her floor and kind of playing with it. And so you could kind of see a little bit under the door. Yeah. And her cat was in the room.
Oh no.
And he walks across, all of this happened like really quickly. He walks across the Ouija board, the cat does, and goes, hisses, and his, just like fur goes up big, and he flies off at the same time that we see a big light fill the room from under her door. Well, what had actually happened is there was a lightning strike, and it struck her chimney and went down the chimney and hit like the not the mantle, but the floor part of the chimney. And there was a storm, but because it all happened right together, you kind of think that correlation is causation. And in our brains, it was because we were messing with the devil stuff. And we threw the Ouija board to the side. We're like, we're never going to play with that ever again. Totally freaked us out. It's easy to have some of those things happen, especially if we were young. But even if we weren't young, if we didn't understand about how to, okay, let's look at this from a critical thinking perspective and what happened. What, did the Ouija board cause the lightning to strike? Or did the lightning, that rush of electricity cause the cat to act that way? And we just happened to be playing with the stupid Ouija board.
Well, on top of that too, in those situations, when you already believe it, when you already think that like, hey, there's like this stuff here, there's this weird energy, then, I was talking earlier about cognitive biases, and one of the most famous ones is called confirmation bias, where you literally are already expecting something bad to happen. You're expecting something evil to happen. And so whether it's a creak in the floorboard, or whether it's a tree falling down outside, or, the wind knocking the shutters in the window, a cat running by, a lightning strike, like you're already looking for something to confirm that. And so it might be air currents in the room that, from a difference in air pressure, or from someone opening a window, or a fan turned on, or a door closing, or even just temperature differences that might cause something to kind of fall off of a ledge. And if you're sitting in that situation and you've got the Ouija board, you're gonna freak out that something demonic happened. And it might have been that you set your foot down on the floor and that little bit of shake caused a vibration that, made it fall off. And so as you're looking for things, and rather than being like, okay, how can we test this? You're looking for anything to confirm what you already believe.
Yeah.
And that's not a sound way to reason.
Exactly. And then you talk with your friends, and you're like, oh yeah, we had the same thing. And the next thing you know, you're down that rabbit hole.
Those stories get amplified.
They do.
So your friend might be like, oh yeah, this happened. And then, they're all telling the story. And then you go back to the original and you're like, oh, we have a video of it. And it's like, oh, it wasn't nearly as dramatic and intense as they described,
Yep, absolutely. So we are a little bit past the hour, and I want to be respectful of your time, but there is one last question I want to get in from the chat. I've heard that once you turn 35, quantum gravitational lensing hinders your ability to jump over things. Is this true?
I mean, something hinders your ability to jump over things, but I just think that it's that I've got some quantum gravitational lensing that I'm building up right here.
Yeah, I'm not even going to talk about what happens after 45. And I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. Absolutely. I think it was just a great conversation. Yeah. Do you have any closing thoughts for all of us?
Yeah, I would say just, look into this more. Go look up logical fallacies. There's a whole site. It's like yourlogicalfallacyis.com. There's another site, I think by the same people, that's on cognitive biases. A great place to start if you're just dipping your toes in is the book Demon Haunted World by Carl Sagan. He has in there a baloney detection kit where it's like how to kind of spot if something is baloney or not, if there's any legitimacy. And especially in the era today with so much, pseudoscience floating around and fake stories and stuff, like go and observe when there's a claim that's being made. What's the source? Look into it. Like, are they citing original sources? Has this stuff actually been published somewhere reliable, or is it this opinion blog that's trying to sell you something? If they're trying to sell you a product that they're claiming cures cancer, it's like, well, they're, kind of have a little bit of an ulterior motive there that, and if it hasn't been reviewed by any outsiders and there's no regulations on it, then, be a little wary, have your guard up, be a little skeptical, be open-minded, be a little curious, explore the world, learn more about as much stuff as you possibly can, but, don't drink the Kool-Aid.
There you go. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Excellent. I want to thank everyone who was watching. There was so many great conversations in the chat. I want to thank everyone for showing up. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, hit the bell, all those great things, because that's extremely important to us to continue to do the work that we do. I want to thank our producers, Wes, Phil, and Kat, and our booking team, Aaron and Shane. Keep in mind, we have other shows on Skeptic Haven. We have Secular Soapbox, Women Atheist Unloaded, Sandbox Debates, One Good Reason, and The Bible Says What. So check all those out. I want to thank our Patreons, Kathy Cotton, Cindy Plaza, Bryce Aroni, Deborah Grace, Aaron Coalson, Phil Calderone, and me. So join us if you want to help, because I'm telling you, every little bit helps. So in the meantime, until next Monday when I see you again, remember to always think critically. Good night, everybody.